From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
So, this week it's Robert E. Lee. I noticed that Stonewall Jackson's coming down. I wonder, is it George Washington next week, and is it Thomas Jefferson the week after? You know, you really do have to ask yourself, where does it stop?
As President Trump faces growing outrage over his response to the deadly white supremacist rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, we'll bring you an exclusive, an interview with two of the great-great-grandsons of Confederate General Stonewall Jackson.
I'm Warren Christian, the great-great-grandson of Confederate General Stonewall Jackson, and my brother and I are calling for the removal of his statue on Monument Avenue in Richmond, Virginia, because we believe the monument is an ongoing symbol of white supremacy and racism in the United States.
We'll also speak with a former neo-Nazi who founded the group Life After Hate, an organization that fights white supremacy. It was recently stripped of its funding by the Trump administration.
Time went on, and I started to become a very respected leader, both locally and regionally, and then it grew to nationally. And internationally, I'd started a band that was singing white power music, racist music that was used to recruit people. It was a powerful propaganda tool for young people to adhere to.
Life After Hate's funding was cut after urging from Trump advisor Sebastian Gorka's wife, Catherine, who works for the Department of Homeland Security. Then we go to Fargo, North Dakota, to speak with a man whose uncle marched with the white supremacists in Charlottesville. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In Charlottesville, Virginia, mourners gathered Wednesday for a memorial service for Heather Heyer, who was killed Saturday when a 20-year-old white supremacist named James Alex Fields plowed his car into a crowd of anti-fascist demonstrators. Heyer was a long-time anti-racist activist who repeatedly championed civil rights issues on social media. This is Heather's mother, Susan Breaux.
Remember in your heart, if you're not outraged, you're not paying attention. And I want you to pay attention, find what's wrong, don't ignore it, don't look the other way. You make a point to look at it and say to yourself, what can I do to make a difference? And that's how you're going to make my child's death worthwhile. I'd rather have my child, but by golly, if I got to give her up, we're going to make it count.
The funeral came after Charlottesville anti-racist organizer Tyler McGill suffered a stroke on Tuesday that friends say was brought on by injuries that the 46-year-old sustained when a neo-Nazi protester beat him with a burning torch last Friday. Doctors say the stroke likely resulted from blunt force trauma to McGill's neck. Meanwhile, two women injured in the terror attack that killed Heather Heyer filed suit against James Alex Field, the white supremacist driver of the car, along with white supremacist organizers behind the Unite the Right event. The pair were among 19 injured in the attack. They're seeking nearly $3.5 million in damages. On Wednesday night, 1,000 people gathered for a candlelight vigil on the University of Virginia campus to call for peace, later marching on the same route used by hundreds of neo-Nazis and white nationalists in their Torchlight March last Friday. In Philadelphia, thousands of demonstrators marched against last weekend's violence in a rally dubbed Philly is Charlottesville. And in Berlin, Germany, hundreds gathered at the Brandenburg Gate to protest against neo-Nazi groups. This is one of the demonstrators.
I'm here because I am against Nazis. My grandfather fought against Nazis in the Second World War, and I think it is a disgrace that Donald Trump is not against Nazis.
President Trump grew increasingly isolated Wednesday for repeatedly blaming both sides for last weekend's violence in Charlottesville, as lawmakers, generals, and prominent Republicans separated their positions from Trump by condemning white nationalists and neo neo-Nazis. In a statement, former Presidents George H.W. Bush and his son George W. Bush said, quote, "America must always reject racial bigotry, anti-Semitism, and hatred in all forms." The Bush's statement came as President Trump disbanded a pair of business advisory councils Wednesday as more CEOs exited the groups in protest of Trump's failure to fully condemn white nationalists. After the heads of 3M and Campbell Soup Company became the latest to resign Wednesday, Trump tweeted, quote, "Rather than putting pressure on the business people of the Manufacturing Council and Strategy and Policy Forum, I'm ending both. Thank you all." According to reports, President Trump knew at that point that the business leaders were all quitting the council. U.S. military leaders also condemned white supremacist groups Wednesday, with top generals of the Air Force, Army, Navy, Marines, National Guard, and U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff all issuing statements against racial hatred. The condemnations came after it emerged that the leader of the Vanguard America neo-Nazi hate group that rallied in Charlottesville, Dylan Ulysses Hopper, was a Marine Corps recruiter. The head of the Department of Veterans Affairs, David Shulkin, also spoke out on Wednesday.
Well, I'm speaking out and I'm giving my personal opinions as an American and as a Jewish American. And for me in particular, I think in learning history that we know that staying silent on these issues is simply not acceptable. I am not going to in any way condone the behavior or the beliefs of the Nazis or white supremacists. This is an affront to American ideals. This is an affront to civilization.
Fallout from President Trump's handling of the Charlottesville violence came amidst revelations that the Trump administration recently cut funds to organizations dedicated to fighting right-wing violence. One group, Life After Hate, which works to help white nationalists and neo-Nazis disengage from hate and violent extremism, was set to receive a grant under the Department of Homeland Security's Countering Violent Extremism program, approved by the Obama administration. When Trump DHS policy advisor Catherine Gorka released the final list of grantees in June, Life After Hate had been eliminated. Gorka is the wife of Trump advisor Sebastian Gorka, who has been linked to a Hungarian far-right Nazi-allied group. Later in the broadcast, we'll speak with the group's founder, Life After Hate's founder, Christian Picciolini. Meanwhile, leaders of 4 congressional caucuses are demanding the White House fire senior aides Sebastian Gorka, Steve Bannon, and Stephen Miller over their white supremacist views. In a letter to President Trump, the Congressional Asian Pacific American Hispanic Progressive and Black caucuses wrote, "We are deeply concerned that their continued influence on U.S. policy emboldens and tacitly approves the ideological extremism that leads white supremacists to spread violence and hatred." The letter came as Steve Bannon, President Trump's chief strategist, granted an extraordinary interview with Robert Kuttner of the liberal magazine The American Prospect. In the article, titled "Steve Bannon Unrepentant," the former Breitbart News editor declared there is no military solution to the North Korean nuclear crisis. And Bannon said the U.S. should engage in an economic war with China. Bannon said he's looking to neutralize rivals in the Departments of Defense, State, and Treasury, and criticize the white supremacists behind last weekend's violence in Charlottesville, calling them ethno-nationalists and a collection of clowns. Bannon is the former head of Breitbart News, the site that's been described as an online haven for white nationalists. It's not clear whether Bannon knew his comments were on the record. The news site Axios reported one unnamed White House staffer said Bannon's comments left him infuriated, saying, quote, "I'll put this in terms he'll understand. This is DEFCON 1 level bad." The city of Greensboro, North Carolina, has apologized for its role in a 1979 incident that saw American Nazis and members of the Ku Klux Klan open fire on anti-fascist protesters, killing 5 people and wounding 10 others. Tuesday's 7-to-1 vote by the Greensboro City Council acknowledges there were no police officers present to protect demonstrators against white nationalist violence. All of the killers were later acquitted in state and federal criminal trials, though a civil case found some of the Klansmen liable for one of the deaths. Attorney General Jeff Sessions joined condemnation against violence in Charlottesville Wednesday, calling out racism, bigotry, hatred, and violence. Sessions' statement came despite his making racist comments throughout his career, including reportedly saying he thought the Ku Klux Klan was okay until I found out they smoked pot, unquote. Meanwhile, Sessions repeated his threats to withhold Justice Department grants to so-called sanctuary cities whose police officers refused to act as de facto immigration enforcement agents.
Policies do far broader damage to the country than many understand. At its root, it is a rejection of our immigration laws and a declaration of open borders.
In Syria, the journalistic monitoring group Air Wars reports U.S.-led airstrikes on Raqqa killed at least 29 civilians and wounded scores of others Tuesday and Wednesday. Among the dead were 3 children, Marwa, Mariam, and Ahmad Mazan Shahab, who were killed along with their mother. The latest civilian deaths came as displaced residents at a camp north of Raqqa said extreme summer heat and a lack of resources was making life unbearable. This is Yusuf Fadawi, who fled Raqqa with his family.
We
get aid packages once a month, and 90% of the people are selling the packages in order to survive. With regards to healthcare, it is very bad. If someone is bitten by a snake or a scorpion, they must go to Kobani or Tel Abyad, and they might even die on the way. There is no first aid here at all.
In the Gaza Strip, a suicide bomber detonated at the border crossing with Egypt Wednesday, killing a member of Hamas and wounding several others. Palestinian authorities said the bomber was a member of ISIS, which would mark the first time the group has targeted Hamas inside the Israeli-controlled territory. The violence came as Gazans continue to suffer under extreme shortages of electricity brought on by Israeli cutbacks supported by Hamas's rival Fatah Party in the West Bank. This is Khan Yunis resident Muna Abu Nemer.
There is no electricity. We barely get it for 2 hours, and we just barely manage to charge our mobile phones. There is no electricity. This is not a way to live. We used to have electricity for 8 hours, and now it is only 2 hours. What can we do in 2 hours? We can't do much.
Last month, the United Nations warned Israel's blockade and electricity cuts have made Gaza unlivable for its more than 2 million residents. In Washington, D.C., trade representatives of the U.S., Canada, and Mexico opened talks Wednesday to renegotiate NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. The Trump administration's pressing Canada and Mexico for concessions, claiming NAFTA's tilted against the United States. Meanwhile, thousands of indigenous activists, workers, and campesinos marched in Mexico City Wednesday, calling for an end to NAFTA. This is Mexican Farmers Representative Jose Naro Cespedes.
Until now, the effects of the treaty have been negative for the country's indigenous people and for rural communities, and above all for the sector that's dedicated to small agriculture.
NAFTA went into effect in 1994. An estimated 2 million agricultural workers left Mexico's rural areas for cities as subsidized U.S. corn and other staples flooded the Mexican market. In the Philippines, police killed 26 people in drug raids across the capital, Manila, overnight, continuing what human rights groups are calling the bloodiest week yet of President Rodrigo Duterte's so-called war on drugs. The killings followed 32 more deaths the previous night during police raids in Bulacan province. Authorities insisted those killed died in shootouts with police, but human rights groups say most of the dead were summarily executed by police. Filipino security forces and vigilantes have killed more than 7,000 suspected drug users and dealers since Duterte launched his campaign against drugs last year. And in sports news, Seattle Seahawks star Michael Bennett sat on the sidelines during the playing of the national anthem Sunday ahead of a preseason game against the Los Angeles Chargers. Bennett said last weekend's neo-Nazi violence in Charlottesville, Virginia, inspired him to take a stand.
I just want to be able to
use my platform to be able to continuously speak on injustice. First of all, I want to make sure people understand I love the military. I love my father was in the military. I love hot dogs like any other American. I love football like any other American, but I don't love segregation. I don't love riots. I don't love oppression. I don't love gender slandering. And I just want to see people have the equality that they deserve.
To see our extended interview with the NFL star, you can go to DemocracyNow.org. Meanwhile, NBA star LeBron James took a jab at President Trump Tuesday during a charitable fundraiser, calling Trump the so-called president of the United States during a speech calling for healing after the weekend's violence in Charlottesville, Virginia. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Momentum is growing across the country to remove Confederate statues in the wake of Saturday's deadly white supremacist neo-Nazi rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. At least 1,500 symbols of the Confederacy can be found in public spaces across the country. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, most of them were built during the early decades of Jim Crow or in reaction to the Civil Rights Movement, not after the Civil War. But now a number of the monuments are coming down. In Baltimore, the city, under orders from the mayor, has just removed all 4 of its Confederate statues. In Durham, North Carolina, protesters toppled a Confederate statue after a college student named Takia Thompson climbed up a ladder and looped a rope around the top of the Confederate soldiers' monument. She appeared on Democracy Now! Just before going to court on Wednesday.
And I did this because the statue is a symbol of nationalism, and it's a symbol of white nationalism. And the type of white nationalism I'm talking about is the type of white nationalism that is sending me death threats on Facebook. I'm talking about the type of white nationalist that, you know, has killed a woman in a protest.
Meanwhile, on Wednesday in Brooklyn, New York, the Episcopal Church removed 2 plaques honoring Robert E. Lee. On Monday, a monument to Confederate soldiers in Gainesville, Florida, was also removed, and several other Confederate monuments are slated to be removed across the country. On Wednesday, Virginia Governor Terry McAuliffe encouraged all local governments to remove Confederate monuments, saying they've become flashpoints for hatred, division, and violence, unquote. And the calls for the removal of the statues are even coming from the descendants of the leaders of the Confederacy. Today, an exclusive interview with 2 of the great-great-grandsons of Confederate General Stonewall Jackson. Jack and Warren Christian have just written an open letter to the mayor of Richmond calling for the removal of the Stonewall Jackson statue in Richmond. They write, quote, "Our sense of justice leads us to believe that removing the Stonewall statue and other monuments should be part of a larger project of actively mending the racial disparities that hundreds of years of white supremacy have wrought. We hope other descendants of Confederate generals will stand with us." Jack Christian joins us from Western Massachusetts, from Chicopee, Mass. And Warren Christian is in Raleigh, North Carolina. Jack and Warren, welcome to Democracy Now! It's great. It's great to have you both with us. Talk about why you've decided to speak out right now. Let's begin with Jack Christian.
Yeah, well, I think that that road definitely is a product of something that we've been thinking about and feeling for a long while now, but was also very much catalyzed by what we saw in Charlottesville, and particularly in Durham, pulling down their Confederate monument. So that inspired Warren and I to kind of feel like this was the time to write this letter.
And Warren Christian, in Baltimore, under cover of night 2 nights ago, the mayor had 4 Confederate monuments pulled down. One of them was a monument of your great-great-grandfather, Stonewall Jackson. your thoughts today and how you came together with Jack to call for the removal of not only monuments to your great-great-grandfather, but all other Confederate monuments.
Yes, well, this, like Jack said, this is something that we've felt for a long time. I think it's very clear if you look at the context in which the monuments were put up. They weren't celebrating kind of benign war heroes. They were very clearly meant to be things that would intimidate black people and further white supremacy in the U.S. Where I work at UNC, there's a prominent Confederate memorial, monument, statue right in the heart of campus. And since I've been at the University of North Carolina, I've wanted for that statue to be removed and felt like speaking out about it, and now finally kind of got the courage to do so. I think Jack and I, and along with our parents, it's kind of some mixed feelings, mixed emotions about being direct descendants of Stonewall Jackson. It's not something that I, widely share outside of a very close group of friends. So this is really kind of a coming out in a sort. And also I think the other thing is, in some ways, I don't feel like it should matter too much, how we feel about the statues, but I do understand that it is important to some folks how we feel about it. And for example, the statue at the University of North Carolina, when it was put up, the speaker, Julian Carr, who was a prominent local businessman, talked a lot about how the Confederate soldiers were working to save the Anglo-Saxon race. And then, really kind of disgustingly, at the end of his speech, he bragged about having his quotes, pleasant duty of horsewhipping a black woman in front of 100 federal soldiers and leaving her clothes in tatters. So I think the racist and white supremacist intent of these monuments is clear, and I think it's past time that they're all removed from the public squares of our country.
You work at the University of North Carolina?
Yeah, so I work at the University of North Carolina, and I'm somewhat disgusted walking past that statue on campus, and I can only imagine how it feels to students of color, and particularly black students who have to walk by that on their way to class. And I know that yes, sorry, Amy?
Have you told the president of the university or other students? You said you've kept pretty quiet about this until now, but about your desires to have that monument to your great-great-grandfather removed.
Not in a public forum, but I'd say this is it. I'd like that statue, of course, removed. I think the University of North Carolina, there's a lot of great people doing great work to try to recruit, retain, and support students of color and black students, and having this monument on campus just completely goes against that spirit.
Jack, can you tell us who Stonewall Jackson was?
Yeah, I'll do my best. It's funny, serendipitous almost, that this summer, earlier in the summer, I had started reading the biography from a few years ago called Rebel Yell by S.C. Gwynn that humanizes Stonewall in some new ways. He's famous. He got his nickname for standing in battle and not being pushed back by federal forces, if I'm not mistaken, in the first Bull Run. And other Confederate generals observed him standing like that and said he's standing like a stone wall. So that's where his nickname comes from. His fame after that is for the Valley campaign that he waged in the western part of Virginia in the Shenandoah Valley, where he with a much smaller force was able to hold off Union forces for a long time. Which had the effect of greatly extending the Civil War in all likelihood. So that's who he was as a soldier. As a person, he was very complicated. He was an orphan who did well academically and graduated high in his class at VMI. He did, in his adult life, own slaves. He also was very religious, and as part of his religious calling, he taught Sunday school to enslaved peoples where he lived in Lexington, Virginia, which was, in my understanding of it, at least controversial, if not an illegal thing to do. So, you know, this is sort of the person that we have kind of all our lives been thinking about, grappling with. That's my thumbnail sketch of him.
We're going to go to a break, then come back to this conversation. Then we're going to go to Fargo, North Dakota, to speak with the nephew of one of the white supremacists who marched in Charlottesville this past weekend. That white supremacist father wrote an open letter on Facebook saying the family was disowning his son, was disowning his white supremacist son. And we're going to speak with a recovered white supremacist who is part of an organization called Life After Hate. This is Democracy Now!, our exclusive interview with the great-great-grandsons of Stonewall Jackson. We'll also hear, after break, them reading a part of the letter that they have written calling for monuments to their great-great-grandfather to be taken down around the country. Stay with us.
Junto a mí, y así verás tu canto y tu bandera florecer, la luz de un rojo amanecer anuncia ya la vida que vendrá. De pie luchar, el pueblo va a triunfar, será mejor la vida que vendrá a conquistar nuestra felicidad. De combate se alzarán, dirán, canción de libertad, con decisión la patria vencerá. Y ahora el pueblo que se alza en la lucha, con voz de gigante, gritando adelante. El pueblo unido jamás será vencido. El pueblo unido jamás será vencido. La patria está forjando la unidad, de norte a sur se movilizará.
T. Ilimani here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we bring you this exclusive interview with two of the great-great-grandsons of the Confederate General Stonewall Jackson, let's go back to President Trump speaking at this fiery, unhinged news conference he had on Tuesday in Trump Tower here in New York.
So, this week it's Robert E. Lee. I noticed that Stonewall Jackson's coming down. I wonder, is it George Washington next week, and is it Thomas Jefferson the week after? You know, you really do have to ask yourself, where does it stop?
So that was President Trump. We're joined by Jack and Warren Christian, two great-great-grandsons of the Confederate General Stonewall Jackson, who have written a letter calling for the removal of the Stonewall Jackson statue in Richmond, Virginia. Warren and Jack, I was wondering if you could both read a part of this open letter that you have written.
Sure, I'd be glad to. I'm going to read the first couple paragraphs, and Warren's going to read the last couple paragraphs. So we write, Dear Mayor LeVar Stoney, that's the mayor of Richmond, and members of the Monument Avenue Commission, we are native Richmonders and also the great-great-grandsons of Stonewall Jackson. As two of the closest living relatives to Stonewall, we are writing today to ask for the removal of his statue, as well as the removal of all Confederate statues from Monument Avenue. They are overt symbols of racism and white supremacy, and the time is long overdue for them to depart from public display. Overnight, 2 nights ago now, Baltimore has seen fit to take this action. Richmond should too. In making this request, we wish to express our respect and admiration for Mayor Stoney's leadership, while also strongly disagreeing with his claim that removal of symbols does nothing for telling the actual truth, nor changes the state and culture of racism in this country today. In our view, the removal of the Jackson statue and others will necessarily further difficult conversations about racial justice. It will begin to tell the truth of all of us coming to our senses. We go on in the letter to detail some of our rationale and family history, and then Warren's going to read the last few paragraphs.
Ongoing racial disparities in incarceration, educational attainment, police brutality, hiring practices, access to health care, and perhaps most starkly wealth, make it clear that these monuments do not stand somehow outside of history. Racism and white supremacy, which undoubtedly continue today, are neither natural nor inevitable. Rather, they were created in order to justify the unjustifiable, in particular, slavery. One thing that bonds our extended family, besides our common ancestor, is that many have worked, often as clergy and as educators, for justice in their communities. While we do not purport to speak for all of Stonewall's kin, our sense of justice leads us to believe that removing the Stonewall statue and other monuments should be part of a larger project of actively mending the racial disparities that hundreds of years of white supremacy have wrought. We hope other descendants of Confederate generals will stand with us. As cities all over the South are realizing now, we are not in need of added context. We are in need of a new context, one in which the statues have been taken down.
Those are the words of Jack and Warren Christian, the great-great-grandsons of the Confederate General Stonewall Jackson, calling for the removal of his monument in Richmond. Are you calling for the removal of his monument around the country, Jack?
We're calling for the removal of his monument in Richmond, firstly, but our argument is that all Confederate monuments and symbols should be removed from public display.
You take a different approach than Bertram Hayes Davis, the great-great-grandson of the Confederate president, Jefferson Davis, who talks about contextualizing monuments. He's not against moving them, perhaps, into museums, but really emphasizes this issue of contextualizing. Warren, your response to that?
I think the context is that they were put up in support of this myth of the lost cause, that the Confederate soldiers were fighting kind of a noble fight, and that doesn't give the full weight to the fact that they were fighting to continue the institution of slavery. And
That's an interesting.
I think so. That's
an interesting point you raise, is that these Confederate monuments didn't go up right after the Civil War, but decades later, with the rise of the Klan and the introduction of Jim Crow laws.
Yeah, and that's why I think they shouldn't be. I don't think any American, and especially Black Americans, should be forced to pass these symbols of white supremacy on their ways to work, church, school. I think we can. I think it's part of our national healing. We're still very clearly, in my eyes, dealing with the effects of slavery, of Jim Crow, of segregation, of racist policies like redlining. And I think this, removing the monuments, ultimately, in my eyes, is just a small step that's necessary for racial healing in the country, along with many other much larger steps that are necessary.
Speaking about a proposed Gettysburg Memorial in 1869, Confederate General Robert E. Lee, quote, said, "I think it wiser not to keep open the sores of war, but to follow the example of those nations who endeavored to obliterate the marks of civil strife, to commit to oblivion the feelings engendered." So even the Confederate general, who has I don't know how many monuments of his likeness, of him, around the country, said there shouldn't be Confederate monuments, Jack. And I wanted to ask if you'd end by talking about whether you have your family's support and, for example, your parents.
Yeah. We have not talked directly to our parents, although we sent the letter to them. But we very much believe that we have their support and know that this works in really in the spirit in which they brought us up to work and to fight for justice. I've been, this letter went up about midnight Eastern time last night, and I've been heartened to see others in our extended family have already reached out and said thank you, and that they appreciate what we've said. We certainly haven't heard from everyone, but the response from our family, and even I've gotten some response from other people who have Confederates in their ancestry that have said that they feel similarly. So we're very heartened by the response so far, both from our family.
As you watch what happened in Charlottesville, do you feel like there is a kind of new civil war in this country?
I certainly hope not. I was sickened by what we saw. I hadn't thought about it in quite so stark of terms, but I have thought about it that we definitely are at incredibly tense and stratified moment, and I think that we need to all take steps to have these conversations and to heal ourselves. So
I wanted to read.
That's my hope.
I wanted to read you a quote from Trump's chief strategist, Steve Bannon, who reportedly is under fire in the White House. Who knows if that's true? But he did an interview with Bob Kuttner of the American Prospect, the liberal magazine, and said, quote, President Trump, by asking, where does this all end? Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, connects with the American people about their history, culture, and traditions. The race identity politics of the left wants to say it's all racist. Just give me more, tear down more statues, say the revolution is coming. I can't get enough of it, Bannon said. Jack, your response.
I wondered if you were going to ask me about that, and I listened to this on the news on my way into the TV station this morning. I think that ironically, part of Trump's statement has to do, choosing my words carefully, part of Trump's statement has to do with a larger conversation that is taking place and that needs to take place, where we recognize that Thomas Jefferson and George Washington were also white supremacists and slave owners, and we think about that history. A writer on the online magazine The Root had a funny but apt take that I think sums it up. That said, the writer said, "Leave it to Trump to have a woke take on Thomas Jefferson," and I think there's some truth or some pithiness there. So go ahead.
Jack and Warren, you're both teachers?
Yes.
Yep.
What will you be telling your students today?
I have until September 6th to think about what I'll tell them.
Well,
I'm in the fortunate, I'm in the fortunate position of working with international students, so it's really great to when they come to the U.S., they very quickly, if they haven't before they got here, realize that race is a huge issue in the U.S., but they still haven't fully formed their decisions. So what I try to do is always, in contextualizing what the situation surrounding race is in the U.S., is starting with slavery and segregation and making sure they understand that history to see how it's led us where we are today. And because they don't have so much kind of skin in the game, they're often very receptive to those messages in a way that working with American students and having discussions about race can be much more difficult.
Well, Warren and Jack, I want to thank you so much for being with us. I think you've taught this whole country a lot today. Jack and Warren Christian, the great-great-grandsons of the Confederate General Stonewall Jackson, written a joint letter calling for the removal of the Stonewall Jackson statue in Richmond, Virginia. We will link to your letter at DemocracyNow.org. When we come back, we're going to be joined by a nephew of one of the white supremacists who marched in Charlottesville, Virginia. And we'll talk about his family's reaction to the extremist activism, disavowing him, disowning him. And we'll speak with the head of an organization that of white supremacists who have changed their ways. It's called Life After Hate. Stay with us.
Yeah, there's a disturbance. Yeah, a riot in my mind. I'm running down the street. Yeah, there's someone trying to do me down. Yeah, there's a disturbance. Yeah, a riot in my mind. A fire burning down the street. Yeah, there's someone trying to do me down. Yeah, there's a disturbance. It's like a circus come to town. I see the wagon swaying down the street. Splintered children in the scattered dark. A riot in my mind. A razor's flying through the doorway. Yeah, there's someone trying to cut me down. Yeah, there's a disturbance. It's like a circus come to town. Shattered mirrors in the hallway. I'm running on the broken glass. Ain't you got a safe place? Is there somewhere safe for me to hide? I'm running.
Boys and girls, riot in my mind here on Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. On Wednesday night, 1,000 people gathered for a candlelight vigil at the University of Virginia campus to call for peace, later marching on the same route used by neo-Nazis and white nationalists in their Torchlight March last Friday. Earlier in the day, a memorial service was held in Charlottesville to remember Heather Heyer, the 32-year-old woman who died on Saturday after she was run down by a neo-Nazi named James Alex Fields. Heyer had repeatedly championed civil rights issues in social media. Her Facebook cover read, "If you're not outraged, you're not paying attention." Her favorite color, purple, which so many people wore at the memorial service yesterday. This is Heather's mother, Susan Breaux.
Remember in your heart, if you're not outraged, you're not paying attention. And I want you to pay attention, find what's wrong, don't ignore it, don't look the other way. You make a point to look at it and say to yourself, what can I do to make a difference? And that's how you're going to make my child's death worthwhile. I'd rather have my child, but by golly, if I got to give her up, we're going to make it count.
Heather Heyer is the latest casualty in a number of deaths at the hands of white nationalists. Foreign Policy has revealed the existence of a recent FBI and Department of Homeland Security bulletin that concluded white supremacist groups were, quote, responsible for 49 homicides and 26 attacks from 2000 to 2016, more than any other domestic extremist movement, unquote. The FBI and Department of Homeland Security report went on to state, quote, racial minorities have been the primary victims of white supremacist violence. The second most common victims were other Caucasians and other white supremacists perceived as disloyal to the white supremacist extremism movement, unquote. Despite the FBI and DHS findings, the Trump administration recently cut funds to groups dedicated to fighting right-wing violence. One of those groups, Life After Hate, which works to help white nationalists and neo-Nazis disengage from hate and violent extremism, was set to receive a grant under the Department of Homeland Security's Countering Violent Extremism program, approved by the Obama administration. When Trump DHS policy advisor Catherine Gorka released the final list of grantees in June, Life After Hate had been eliminated. Gorka is the wife of Trump advisor Sebastian Gorka, who's been linked to a Hungarian far-right Nazi-allied group. For more, we're joined by Christian Picciolini, who is co-founder of Life After Hate, leading neo-Nazi skinhead gang member and far-right extremist in the 80s and 90s, author of Romantic Violence, Memoirs of an American Skinhead. Christian, welcome to Democracy Now! Talk about your response to what happened in Charlottesville.
Well, I think I went to bed, Amy, on Sunday with a sick feeling in my stomach like most Americans did. But I have to tell you, what I saw last night with the community gathering together was what America means to me. I saw people of all different races, all different colors, creeds, religions, gathered together to pay homage to a woman who essentially gave her life to fight something that is very un-American. And that gives me hope. That gives me hope for America, because I know that we want to be able to live in a country where we can get along, where we have equal justice, where the systems of racism and the institutions are rebooted so that they're fair for everybody. And I think that this is a turning point for America, because I think we can stop sweeping it under the rug and thinking that we don't have a problem here. It's time to face it head on and make sure that it doesn't happen again.
Christian, when did you become a white supremacist?
I was recruited at 14 years old in 1987.
Where did you live?
I was in Chicago, and that was the home and the birthplace of the American neo-Nazi skinhead movement. In fact, I was standing in an alley at 14 years old, and a man pulled his car up as I was smoking a joint, and he came over to me and he said, "Don't you know that that's what the communists and Jews want you to do to keep you docile?" 14, I was a marginalized kid. I'd been bullied. I didn't know what a communist or a Jew or even what the word docile meant. But this man brought me into a family. He gave me an identity, and he fed my sense of purpose. While it was all misdirected, being marginalized and disaffected and feeling abandoned, I was willing to trade in the feeling of power when I felt the most powerless for something that was evil and eventually swallowed whole.
And can you talk about the groups you were in and what you did?
I was a member of the Chicago Area Skinheads, which was America's first neo-Nazi skinhead group. Eventually, I became the leader of that group when the man who recruited me, who was America's first neo-Nazi skinhead, went to prison. I became the leader of this very infamous group, and we were involved in acts of violence. Our primary goal was marketing and recruitment. I started a band, which was a white power band that had violent lyrics that incited people to go out and commit hate crimes. And that was a recruiting tool. It was a social movement to get people together, young, angsty teenagers who were angry at the world, who felt like they had been pushed aside, and now were given somebody to blame for that.
What was it that started you moving away and questioning what you were doing?
You know, for the 8 years that I was involved, Amy, I had doubts the whole time. I came from an Italian immigrant family who came to the U.S. in the 60s, who were often the victims of prejudice. So I wasn't raised with these racist beliefs. It wasn't part of my family DNA or fabric. I questioned myself the whole time, but I squashed it because the power and the acceptance were more important to me, and I was scared to lose that. But essentially, over those 8 years, I started to meet people who I'd kept outside of my social circle, who I hated, African Americans and Jews and gay people. But the truth was that I had never had a meaningful interaction with them. But when I started to receive compassion from the people that I least deserved it from when I least deserved it. They could have attacked me, they could have threatened me, they could have broken my windows, but they didn't, and they knew who I was, and they took it upon themselves to show me empathy when I deserved it the least, and that helped me humanize them and dispel all the stereotypes that I had in my head, and suddenly I couldn't reconcile my hate anymore.
And what was the response of the other white supremacists in your group?
Well, they certainly weren't pleased, but luckily I was a pretty selfish leader and I never really groomed anybody to take over locally, so when I left, the group kind of imploded. However, I was a national and international figure at the time, and there were definitely threats of calling me a race traitor, you know, insinuations that I had started working with police, which were not true, and I still to this day receive death threats almost on a daily basis.
I wanted to turn to a white supremacist at the Charlottesville rally this weekend. This is white supremacist Christopher Cantwell, who was speaking with Vice reporter Elle Reeve about, well, among other issues, Ivanka Trump.
I'm here to spread ideas, talk, in the hopes that somebody more capable will come along and do that. Somebody like Donald Trump, who does not give his daughter to a Jew.
So Donald Trump, but like more racist.
A lot more racist than Donald Trump. I don't think that you could feel about race the way I do and watch that Kushner bastard walk around with that beautiful girl, okay?
That is white supremacist Christopher Cantwell. I'm sure you saw clips of him, this Vice interview. Christian, your thoughts? In another part of this, they visit him where he's staying, and he has one gun after another throughout his waistband that he brings out, and finally brings out a knife, and he says he's well armed for more violence.
This gentleman is an insecure, has no self-confidence and is clearly broken. There's something broken. I'm a firm believer that ideology isn't what radicalizes people. I think it's the search for identity, community, and a sense of purpose. And if there's some sort of brokenness, a void underneath that in your life, and it could be trauma or addiction or mental health issues, anything that would hold you back or deviate your path from the intended one that you were on, you tend to look for acceptance in negative pathways. And it's interesting that we brought up this clip because I've actually reached out to this man after I saw the videos because he clearly needs help. And I want to offer him a compassionate ear to listen to what it is that is broken about him, because what we do at Life After Hate is rather than argue ideologically with people, because we know that that just polarizes us further, we try to make the person more resilient, more competitive, more self-confident. And we do that by applying services like mental health therapy or job training or life coaching or even tattoo removal. And when that person feels more confident, they tend to blame the other less. But I would follow that up with challenging their doctrine, not by telling them they're wrong, but by introducing them to the people that they think that they hate. I may introduce a Holocaust denier to a Holocaust survivor, or an Islamophobe to spend a day with a Muslim family and have dinner. And it's those connections, those moments, because most people have never met the people that they hate, that helps them humanize these people and dispel the ideas of them being a monster or a parasite. And that has been the most effective tactic that we've used.
Christian, President Donald Trump's top counterterrorism advisor, Sebastian Gorka, has faced increasing calls to resign after the Jewish American newspaper, The Forward, reported Gorka is a sworn member of a Hungarian far-right Nazi-allied group. The Forward reported members of the Vitezi Rend have confirmed that Gorka took a lifelong oath of loyalty to their group, which the U.S. State Department says was under the direction of the Nazi government of Germany during World War II. If the report's true, it means Gorka may have lied on his U.S. immigration application, which requires people to disclose ties to such organizations. Gorka has denied reports of his involvement with the Nazi-allied group, telling Tablet magazine, "I have never been a member of the Vitezi Rend." And I wanted to ask you about the connection of Gorka to your loss of funding. Well, there's Sebastian Gorka in the White House, a counterterrorism advisor, top advisor to Donald Trump. But then there's also Gorka's wife at the Department of Homeland Security.
You know, I think that there are a lot of connections to white supremacists, white nationalists, and the alt-right in the White House at the moment. You know, aside from Gorka, we have Steve Bannon, who is clearly a manipulative propagandist. We have Stephen Miller, who has a long-standing history of being a racist. And we have Sebastian Gorka and his wife, Catherine, who are very much anti-Islam. Not anti-ISIS, but anti-Islam in general. So it doesn't surprise me at all that we were the only organization that was focused on countering far-right extremism that was cut from the program. In fact, we're the only organization in the Western Hemisphere that focuses on disengaging far-right extremists. So, you know, with views held like the Gorkas have, it does not surprise me at all. It's disheartening because I really think that it's going to hurt our ability to be able to tackle probably the biggest problem we're facing right now in America, which is white domestic terrorism.
Another participant in the white supremacist rally in Charlottesville was a man named Peter Teft. He was outed by the Twitter group, Yes, You're Racist, which had been posting screenshots of participants in an effort to expose them. The site posted a picture along with the tweet, "This charming Nazi is Pete Teft of Fargo, North Dakota." Well, on Monday, Pierce Teft publicly denounced his white supremacist son, Peter, in an open letter published in the Forum, a newspaper in Fargo. The letter read in part, quote, "I, along with all of his siblings and his entire family, wish to loudly repudiate my son's vile, hateful, and racist rhetoric and actions. We do not know specifically where he learned these beliefs. He did not learn them at home," his dad wrote. The letter ended, quote, "Peter, you will have to shovel our bodies into the oven too. Please, son, renounce the hate, accept and love all." Joining us now is Jacob Scott, nephew of Peter Teft. Jacob, your uncle marching in Charlottesville. Talk about what's happening in your family right now. You, too, live in Fargo, North Dakota, where we're speaking to you.
I do. Peter had, for a long time, been a bit of a bully and kind of unstable, and my cousin and I had long wanted there to be some kind of reaction to this from the family, some kind of repudiation. It was after Charlottesville, after he was involved in a demonstration that killed a person, that we were kind of finally able to get the rest of the family on board with us. And we had been kind of forthcoming to the community. There had been posters that had been put up around Fargo by some other people who had encountered him and who had dealt with his hate, kind of saying, with his picture on them, saying, this is Pete Teft, he's a Nazi, he's not welcome in this community. And when these posters started coming up, people started talking to me and my cousin, and we were like, yeah, he's a Nazi, you should disassociate with him if you know him. But, going to what the guy who founded Life After Hate said, I do think his ideology comes from something deeper than just, the facts or the values. He really, I feel like there's something broken about him as a person, and he's often he'll get very, very emotional very, very suddenly if you get him flustered. And he'll get violent. I mean, there was an incident where he attempted to assault my other cousin. So I definitely do agree with the idea that this comes from something more deep-seated.
How did his white nationalism happen? Did you see it as you were growing up? Are you about the same age? Even though he's your uncle?
I'm a little younger than him. I'm the oldest of my generation. He's the youngest of his generation. So even though we're uncles, we're closer to age.
And
we're more like cousins.
What does it mean to say that his father has disowned him?
What was that?
What does it mean to say that his dad has disowned him? His family
Well,
has disowned
it means that he's not welcome at family gatherings anymore. It means that pretty much nobody in our family would welcome him into our homes. To answer your first question, our whole family, I mean, we're all progressives, we're all feminists, but around 2012, around the time of the Ron Paul presidential campaign, Peter started getting off into these sort of fringe internet spaces like 4chan and InfoWars and the like, and he started kind of swallowing up that whole mythos. And once he got inundated in that, he just kept moving further and further and further right, and this all happened kind of behind our backs. He became a men's rights activist, and then a couple years ago, he showed up to a family gathering and started ranting about the Jews, and I asked him if he identified as a white nationalist, and he said, yeah, I'm a fascist.
Well, his father wrote, Jacob, his father wrote in this open letter, the thing about it, that his son once joked, the thing about us fascists is it's not what we don't believe in freedom of speech. You can say whatever you want. We'll just throw you in an oven. So his father wrote, Peter, you will have to shovel our bodies into the oven, too. This is part one of our conversation. You and Christian, we will continue with in dialogue together. Jacob Scott, nephew of the white nationalist Peter Teft, who marched in Charlottesville, and Christian Picciolini, former neo-Nazi co-founder of Life After Hate, just defunded by the Trump administration. I'm Amy Goodman. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. Thanks for joining us.